So last week we started our look at the book of Genesis with sort of big picture ideas about Genesis, general organization to the first 11 chapters. Talked about some ideas regarding the historicity versus the mythology ideas about Genesis 1 through 11. But today we're going to dive into chapter 1. So if you haven't already, open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1, and we'll spend our time here in this chapter. Now, before we start Genesis chapter 1, I want to give you guys some background about me and sort of how I'm approaching this chapter and then our class this morning. So most of you guys know sort of my background. You know, I'm a professor at UAB. I have a PhD in cell biology. And so all throughout my training, you know, undergraduate and graduate training, I dealt with these ideas about creation versus evolution a lot. And I went to college at Freed-Hardeman, which obviously is going to be very a creationist perspective on the origins. But I went to graduate school at UAB here in Birmingham, and it's a very other end of the spectrum, very much an evolutionist perspective on the origins of the world and then, of course, life itself. So we're going to talk a lot today about these two kind of competing ideas about the origin story, creation versus evolution. And I'll throw in some biology as we go through this, but I'll try not to bore you with too much biology. But I have a lot to say about biology and its role in the origin story. So if you have questions, you want to dive deeper, feel free to ask them today or ask after class, and I'll be happy to talk more about sort of the scientific perspective on all this that I really enjoy discussing. Okay, so chapter 1 details the Genesis account of the creation story. But before we get to verse 1 of chapter 1, the question I want to pose to you is, what about before Genesis 1:1? You know, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What was going on before the beginning? This is more of a philosophical question, maybe, but what do you think? What do you think it was like? What was God doing before the beginning? So if you look at the book of the Bible before Genesis, if that were to exist, what would that say? What would that look like?
There'd be planning.
What's that?
Planning.
Planning, okay. God is setting in motion his plans. What kinds of plans would he be laying?
He'd be thinking about how he's going to create the earth.
Okay.
He's going to be talking about how he's going to bring about people that will carry on his mission.
All right, so before we do anything, not always, but usually we sort of plan things out, okay? And usually it works better if you put some thought into it, if you plan it out. So yeah, God would have been planning things out. And actually we'll look at a verse later on in Ephesians where God laid out the plan of salvation before the beginning. So we have evidence in the Bible that there was planning involved. He laid out his plans for salvation of mankind even before the beginning. Any other thoughts? Mackenzie, you want to say something? I can tell.
Well, that won't be worth it.
So my take on this question is that it's under the assumption that there was time before this, right? And, you know, the way we read the Bible on the characteristics of God is that he just is. Right?
Okay.
There's no beginning, there's no end, just is, which puts him outside of time. So what was God doing before the beginning? He just was. I don't know how to explain that.
See what I mean? See what did that mean?
No, Ray, I think Mackenzie brought up a very good point.
Thank you, Will.
Well, I see, for me, it's hard to even go anywhere because where did God come from? I don't understand eternity per se. All these things that are eternal, I don't understand that. So it's hard for me to even come up with a concept of what God was doing, any of this, because I don't understand it.
And that answer right there, and even what Mackenzie said, are sort of the heart of this question, okay? But this is a question that we get asked, right? You know, people ask you, well, if there is a God, who made him? Where did he come from? What's he been doing all this time? These are the questions that people are going to ask us when they find out, oh, you believe in God. Well, what is a God? Where has he been all this time? What was he doing before the creation? Where did he come from? Who created him? And so there's a lot we don't know, obviously. All right, but here are things that we do know, okay? We know that God created time, God created matter, God created energy, all on day one, or around that time when he started the creation of the universe. Before that, there was no time. There was no matter, there was no energy, because everything in our universe, here on Earth, the sun, the moon, all the planets, all the stars, our whole galaxies, these are all comprised of things that God created. So before that, there was no universe. Our universe is a tangible, a physical thing, but God is a spiritual being. God resides, I won't say he lives, but lives, resides, I'm not sure the best word to use there. God lives, God resides outside of the physical universe. So God wasn't just hanging out in our universe doing whatever. There was no universe. God, where we're going to go at the end of our existence here on earth, is a spiritual location. We're not going to go somewhere else in the universe where our spirit's going to reside. We're going to go to that place that is outside of matter, outside of time. If you ask, what was God doing 1,000,000 years before the beginning of the earth? We don't know, but you could also say there was an infinite length of time before that as well, because God is an eternal being. He always was, he always will be. So these questions are very hard to tackle, but keep in mind these important points, that God is eternal, he's a spiritual being. He's not living in our universe, he's living outside of our universe. Everything that we know, literally everything that we know, was created by God. From here on earth to the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, everything, it was all created by God. A few verses that I wanted to point out. Isaiah 43:10. If you flip over to that verse, and then if I can get someone to also flip over to Revelation 1:8, we'll look at these verses here. And I will go to Ephesians 1:4. All right, who's got Isaiah 43:10? Nathan?
You are my witness, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, and there will be none after me.
Before me there was no God formed. After me there will be no God formed. It's only been God. Nothing before, nothing's going to come after. Anyone have Revelation 1, verse 8? Go ahead.
I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty.
All right. I'm the beginning, I'm the end. I'm all that there is. All right? And if you look at Ephesians 1-4, we referenced this one earlier on. This is Paul writing to the Ephesians. Even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. He chose us. He chose us to be his elect, to be the saints. He laid out this whole plan of salvation before the foundations of the world. All this was set in motion by God before our origin story, before our universe, all of our matter, all of our energy was created that we know of. God was. Outside of time, outside of matter, energy, God was. All right.
And so Christ was with him at that time as well.
That's where we're going to come to next. So who was there? Who was there? So we know from Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If you look at a few other verses outside of this, we learn that all three of the Godhead were. All three of the Godhead were present at creation, took part in creation. All three members of the Godhead simply were. They existed just like God did in this eternal time frame. Genesis 1 and verse 2, the next verse, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So we have God the Father that was present. We have God the Spirit that was present during this creation. And then if you look over in John chapter 1, the first couple of verses of John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and nothing that was made without him. So the Word, Jesus, was not made by God. The Word was God, and the Word has been around on this eternal time scale, just like God the Father. We don't know the extent to which all three of these members of the Godhead took part in the creation account, but we know they were all present. And we know the Word was essential for this process, because it says in John 1, all things were made through him. Almost like God was the initiator, and he used Jesus as like a funnel to do the creation account. All things were made by or through the Word, through Jesus. So they were all there. They all took part in this creation event. All right, so we're not going to go a verse-by-verse look at Genesis 1. We're going to take some big picture looks here and then cover some difficult concepts revolving around the creation account and cover those in more of a topical approach as opposed to day 1, day 2, day 3. But we are going to look at sort of big picture overview of the creation account. And if you look at Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So there are different thoughts about what this verse means. And you can think of it as being, this is an overview of creation. All right, this is like a summary of the creation account. But I tend to take a little different approach to this. It seems to me that this is like, I want to say day zero, okay? Before God made light, before there was this day-night cycle, God created matter. He created energy. He created the laws of physics. The things that govern our universe, God spoke them into existence, just like he did animals and plants and light. All right? But it was unordered. It was unstructured. It was chaotic. And the remaining days of creation are God molding this thing that he has created into an ordered and structured world, an ordered and structured universe. All right? So my take on this is, pre-day one, or you might say day one, before light made day-night cycles, God spoke what we know of into existence. But it wasn't ordered or structured. It was sort of just this chaotic mass of matter and energy, all right, all governed by the laws of physics that we know govern our universe today. And then day 1 through day 3, God is separating things apart. He's bringing order to the chaos, all right? On day 1, what does he separate? Light and dark. So the first thing he separates are light and darkness. He's bringing the first level of order to our universe. He's creating light and separating light from darkness. All right? On day 2, let's look at verse 6. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from those that were above the expanse." So what is God separating now on day 2? Do what? All right, he's separating the heavens, the sky, the universe. If you look up, whatever you see, that's the heavens spoken of here. He's separating what is on the earth from what is outside of the earth. All right, he's bringing order. We have earth and we have skies. He's separating those two. Another level of order he's bringing to this chaos is separating the waters on earth from the waters that were above the earth, separating the skies from the actual earth itself. And then in verse 9, and God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters he called the seas. So what is he separating now on day 3, the first part of day 3? On the earth specifically, he's separating water and land. So first of all, light and dark. Then he separates sky from earth. And now on the earth, he's separating land from waters. So he is separating things. He's bringing organization to his creation. And once he establishes the skies, once he establishes the earth with land and with water, now he begins to populate these areas with life.
Well, got a question. So in that next section, the sun, moon, and stars are created.
Mm-hmm.
So, you mentioned the land and the water, and I can envision that, and the earth and the heavens, and I can envision that.
Mhm.
The light and the darkness part, I only can think of in the context of the sun and the moon and
Right.
how they provide light and darkness.
You're jumping ahead.
Oh, sorry.
We're going to come to that.
I'm going back to light and darkness.
Okay.
Okay, so if you're going to deal with that later.
We're going to come to that. That's one of those difficult questions, is what was that light? Because it predates the sun. And so we're going to come to that question here in a minute. So
All right,
pause briefly. All right, so we have these areas of our universe, and God's going to populate them now with life. So the latter part of day 3 on into day 6, he's going to populate each of these areas with life. So we know that he puts plants and vegetation on the land in the latter part of day 3. All right, and then day 4, we're going to make birds and fish galore, right? So he's going to put animals into the seas that are swimming, the fish. He's going to put animals into the skies, right? The birds up in the skies. And then on day 5, he's going to populate, not with life per se, but he's going to populate our universe with planets, with the sun, with the moon. So before this, you can kind of imagine the universe as being more or less an empty space. But now he's going to add the sun, the moon, the star. He's going to add all of these celestial bodies, not populating with life, but putting things into our universe outside of the earth itself. And the sun is one of those creations on day 5. And so that's where you come to this point that Tim brought up, is that the sun became into existence on day 5. What was the light God made on day 1? And we'll kind of come back to that. And then on day 6, he's going to make all the animals that live on the land, including humankind, Adam and Eve. All right, so he's going to put animals in the water, animals on the land, plants on the land, animals in the sky, and he's going to put all of these, celestial bodies, all the planets and stars and moons, up into the heavens and throughout the universe. All right, so if you think about the creation account, this is how I like to break it down. All right, he just speaks things into existence, and then he spends the first 3 days organizing them, and then he spends the remaining 3 or 4 days populating them with what's on there now, the life forms that are on there now. All right, and then on day 7 it says that he rested, and we know that God didn't exactly rest. He wasn't tired from all of his work, but rather he just ended his creation. All right, the resting that took place on day 70 is God ceasing from his creation. All right, and that day 7 is going to play largely into the Sabbath day that we'll discuss later on, that the Jews built their Sabbath holiday around, or that God initiated based off of this account. Thoughts, questions?
Do you think how this was all put together, do you think it's where all of our calendaring and everything is derived from as part of Genesis 1?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the account, it says, on day 5, when he made the sun and the moon, it was so there'd be days and years and seasons.
Yeah.
So the
Think about
cycles.
weeks, the fact that we have 7 days in a week.
Yeah, I mean, the Jews built their 7-day week around this creation cycle, with the Sabbath day being the memorial to the day that God ended his creation, the day that he rested. So yeah, a lot of what we do today, our week, our calendars, revolve around what took place, 6,000 years ago in the creation.
Okay, so I won't go back to it tonight. So verse 9 talks about the waters under the heavens being gathered together in one place. So do you think at that point in time, was there one mass of water maybe and one mass of land? Or
It's hard to know exactly. Some people, I don't really have a sway either way, but some people say that the waters he separated above and below were the waters on the earth versus this canopy of water that surrounded the earth. And that canopy is thought to maybe have replaced rain because it didn't rain for perhaps until Noah's day. There's some evidence that supports that. And then when it rained and the flood came, that was the canopy falling to the earth. That's where all the water came from. The flood of the earth was that huge canopy around. I don't know if that's actually the way it was or not, but it seems like he definitely separated waters on the earth from the water in the sky. And there's water in the sky even today, right? We have water vapor, we have clouds. There is definitely water in our sky above us that were separated, so the evaporated water, separated from the water that was on the earth. Is that sort of your question? Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but it definitely seems like it's pointing to water being pulled apart. It was all in one mass, and God pulls it apart to create the sky and the clouds in the sky from, the water that forms our oceans and rivers.
I think about in Isaiah where God's thoughts are higher and his ways are higher than ours, and then I come back to creation here and I think of the complexity. If he were to try to explain it so that we understood his question about the water, the light, all these things, his ways are so much above anything we could even conceive of.
Exactly.
To imagine that, you have to leave things a little vague, or a lot vague.
Well, this is Moses writing.
Yes.
And his knowledge of science is far less than what we know today. So this is Moses writing about things that he probably barely understands.
It's called inspiration.
Yeah.
But see, that doesn't satisfy the mind of people outside the world. Now, we readily accept that because we're Christians and we know the scriptures are what they say they are and we believe in it. But there are others outside of that that wouldn't accept that what Jim's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Am
It's
I-
true.
Am I right about that?
No, it's right. It takes a lot more things you have to bring into the puzzle to start convincing someone of this as an alternative to what they maybe have learned.
This is good for us here, right here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We're going to get to some evidences that can be used
Yeah.
for the other as well.
Okay.
But you think about oxygen. How can you understand that concept back then, or
You can't.
we know from science today, but still, it's
Yeah, no, you can't. You can't at all. I mean, there's so much we know today that wasn't known then they couldn't have had a chance of understanding that because they just didn't have the level of technology and research and all that we've learned throughout the last 6,000 years to our advantage. This is going to go to Tim's point. God said, "Let there be light," but he didn't make the sun until day 5. So what was the light that God created there on day 1? All right, so here's what I can tell you, Tim. Okay, number 1, it was created, so it was not God himself. The light was not God. We don't think it was Jesus himself because it was a created light. And that rules out the Godhead as being the source of this light. Number 2, we have day-night cycles on days 1, 2, 3, and 4, all before the sun was created. So it seems like the earth was revolving around this light, much like the earth revolved around the sun, because we still had these day-night cycles that we still have even today. It probably provided heat for the earth's ecosystem. Plants and animals had to survive up until day 5. Now, that's not a long time, 3 or 4 days. But, animals couldn't have lived in pure darkness or in the frigid cold of the earth prior to light that also gave off heat. And then the sun replaced that light. Whatever the light was, whatever its source was, the sun replaced it on day 4. When God created the sun on day 4, then the sun most likely replaced whatever that light actually was. That's the best I got for you, Tim. If you have something else, I'm happy to add that to my list here of characteristics of this sort of unknown light. God made it. It was a temporary light until the sun became into existence. And it provided light, it provided day-night cycles and heat for the earth up until the sun actually was created. Okay, so how long were these days? So this is a big deal in talking with people today about creation versus evolution, and then this hybrid of the two, theistic evolution. So there are two sort of differing ideas about the creation account. So if you believe in Genesis chapter 1, all right, you can fall into one of these two categories basically. The first is that these days that were spoken of in Genesis 1 were not truly 24-hour periods. They were rather long periods of time, ages, if you will, millions to billions of years represented one day in the Genesis account. The other idea that I fall into, we call ourselves young earth creationists. We believe in the creation account. We believe that these were literal 24-hour periods of time, and that places the earth around 6,000 years. So scientists who are also believers kind of segregate into these two categories. You have the young earth creationist, and then you have the theistic evolutionist that generally fall into this day-age theory group. Okay? So the day-age theory is the idea that the word day, the Hebrew word yom, that's used here by Moses to we translate now as day, was not an actual 24-hour period, but rather it's this long age, this long period of time. And what that does is it allows time for evolution to generate the life that we know of today. So it's a way of taking creation and evolution, melding them together, and kind of making it all work to some extent. And part of the background for this is from 2 Peter. So turn over in your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 3. And let's look at this passage very briefly here. So in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter is dealing with the people that he's writing to are having difficulty with this whole, when's Jesus coming back? When is the return going to take place? And Peter's sort of addressing this idea here. So if you look starting in verse 4, 2 Peter 3:4, they will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. So they're saying, it's just day after day, it's all the same. He's not coming back. He says he's going to come back. He's not coming back. When is Jesus going to come back? And so Peter says in verse 8, do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. So in the context of 2 Peter, Peter is saying God's time scale is not your time scale. All right? In God's time scale, a day, 1,000 years is sort of all the same. Because remember, God lives outside of time. He's not bound by time like we are. And Peter's saying, basically, be patient. It's going to happen. It might not happen in your lifetime because God's time scale is very different than our time scale, but it's going to happen. Jesus is going to come back. But because of that verse there, people take the idea that 1 day could be the equivalent of 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years, and they apply that then to the word day used in the Genesis account. And thus you get what's known as typically the day-age theory. It allows time for creation to take place over many, 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 many years, and therefore evolution is what's bringing life into existence, not the direct actions of God himself. And there are some flaws with that, and we don't have time to go into a lot of them, but one of the main ones I want to look at is Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. So flip over to Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. So Exodus 20, Moses receives the 10 Commandments from God. And in verse 11, he receives specifically the commandment regarding the Sabbath day. All right, so if you look at verse 11, So this is the Ten Commandments being given out. But in verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So right here, God is handing out this commandment to the Israelites that every Sabbath day is supposed to be a holy day. They're going to rest from their work, just as God rested from his creation. If the days of creation were millennia, each one was millions of years long, what's the point in making a 6-week work week and then resting on the seventh day? That commandment by God makes no sense if you don't actually have creation on the same time scale that the Sabbath was based upon. So to me, that's one of the strongest evidences in the Bible itself that actually was a 7-day creation. 7 or 6 24-hour time periods. And then God ceased to create. He rested on the seventh. And then God mirrored that exact time frame right here in his laws to the Israelites for their work week, and they're resting now on the seventh day. And the same word for day is used in both accounts. The Hebrew word yom is used in both accounts. It doesn't have a different meaning in one versus the other. Moses is writing both these accounts, and he's using that word literally for a 24-hour time period in both accounts. There are obviously other things we go into, but for lack of time, we can't. But that's one of the strongest evidences in the Bible itself for me to argue against this whole day-age theory, is the mirroring then for the Sabbath. Yep, Kevin.
Do modern-day Jews still respect the seventh-day Sabbath as a holy day? They do absolutely nothing. I mean, in today's setting.
I actually don't know the answer to that question.
I think it just depends.
Depends on how
Depends on the person.
devout they are. And
So what is that question again?
his question was, do modern-day Jews today still respect the Sabbath as you don't work, that it's truly a day of rest? I do know that some Jews respect it, but there are certain things that they do on the Sabbath regardless. And the context I know of is like working in the hospital. Like doctors, nurses, they still work on Saturday because they consider that to be a necessity. You have to be at the hospital working with your patients, even on Saturday. So even the ones who do fully respect it, they still work in the medical setting, and I at least know that much about it. Mackenzie?
I got a question. So I know there's all kinds of time measurements out there, and I don't understand any of them. But is there any, like from a secular standpoint, time measurement that supports the young Earth perspective?
You mean like scientific, like geology and those kinds of things?
Yeah, it could be geology, it could be measurement of lights, different things like that.
We're on the outskirts of my knowledge base at this point in time. So it's hard for me to say which ones do versus it. I don't have a good answer for you in that capacity. The next thing we can mention is sort of to that point a little bit is, so how old is the earth, right? So for the young earth creationists, like I'm assuming most of us fall into this category, all right? You may not know that term, but that's basically what you are sort of in this setting here. It's said the earth is about 6,000 years old. I mean, there's some error here, give or take, but about 6,000 years old. So how do we come to that number? Well, just based off of the Bible, and some archaeology plays in there as well, here we come to these numbers here. So, I mean, we know from recorded history that from Jesus till today is about 2,000 years, right? This is 2018. So roughly 2,000 years from Jesus to today. That's confirmed. We have historical accounts of that time. So there's no arguments about that length of time. From Jesus back to Abraham, Luke 3 records that as being 55 generations of people. Okay? And this is also based on archaeology and not greatly disputed here, but that's also right about 2,000 years. So the 55 generations from Jesus back to Abraham is, again, right around 2,000 years. We have the genealogies to support that, and also just archaeology also supports that rough time frame. Now, the time frame that is most disputed, I would say, is from Abraham back then to Adam. Several genealogies record this as being 20 generations. So Luke 3 and 2 genealogies in Genesis all indicate 20 generations take place from Abraham then back to Adam. And the Genesis accounts tell you how old the person was when he had kids and how old he was when he died. And you can numerically calculate that back. And again, it hits right around 2,000 years. And the reason these two are so the same time, but different generations, is based off the longevity of people. So people lived a lot longer before the flood, largely, and even after the flood as well. So we have fewer generations, but the same length of time, just because the lifespan of man was much longer back before the flood. And so this is how we base, from a combination of history, archaeology, and the Bible, sort of the age of the earth. That's where these numbers come from. All right, it breaks down to about 2,000 years at each of these three kind of blocks of time. And so we come to approximately a 6,000-year-old earth, which is vastly different from the age of the earth that you'll hear about, from science and evolution. And that, I don't even know what the number is, X, whatever, billion years old, right? It changes from person to person. But, massively different numbers here for our age of the earth versus sort of the scientific ideas about age of the earth. And there are other evidences, geology and so forth, that depends. I'm going to come to you, Tim. I didn't ignore you. That you might could say support one or the other, but a lot of that's up for interpretation. And all this radiocarbon dating of things also up for interpretation, because from the creation account, God created the earth in its adult form. He didn't make every animal, every plant a seed or an egg or a baby. They were created as adults. So that's going to skew, how we look at archaeology, but geology, radiocarbon dating. That's going to skew all that because things were made in their adult form, not everything from literally the beginning. It wasn't just a bunch of seeds. It was God made, full-grown plants, full-grown animals.
500-year-old tree.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that skews sort of these ways that we have of looking at things. Tim.
So, question about the day age folks. So, you said that they're theistic, or at least some of them are theistic evolutionists, right?
Right. So the ones that are purely evolutionists, not theists, well, they just discount Genesis altogether.
Yeah.
So they're just age theorists. There's no day age combined.
So the day part, so they do believe in the 7-day or the 6-day account of creation in some form, right?
Most of them will fall into the Genesis 1 through 11 is mythology group.
All right, because I was going to ask the question about, do they believe in the evening and morning concept? Do they believe that on day 3 God made flowers and grass and trees, and so
that wouldn't make
they
sense.
die at night,
Right. How can animals and plants live without the sun? If there's no moon, there's no tides. So they're going to fall into that group we talked about last week, right? Genesis 1 through 11 is really more mythology than actual history. They'll fall into that group.
I worked with a gentleman that believes that Genesis is wrapped up in the Big Bang Theory.
Mm-hmm.
God used the Big Bang Theory
Yes.
to create everything.
Yes. And that's exactly right. So the theistic evolutionist, and that's a spectrum, they're not all one and the same, then they will pull in all the scientific ideas about origins, both origins of the universe, aka Big Bang, and life, evolution, and they'll mold it all together with the Genesis account. All right, we are short on time, so let me quickly go through a couple more things here before the next bell rings. So, thinking about life itself, right? Genesis says God made animals, plants, birds, fish. He made all of these living things. We know from biology that all living things share a lot of similarities, all right? On the biological level, there are great similarities in us, even from plants, right? We all have DNA. We're all made of cells. We all undergo transcription translation to make our proteins, right? We all do a lot of the same things, even animals, bacteria, plants. We're all very, very similar, at the biological level. So these similarities in biology then ask the question, where does life come from? Common descent or common design? And that's going to be our cliffhanger because we're out of time. So we're going to come back to this idea next week and talk more about sort of this idea about life. Common descent versus common design. So if you want to look into that in the meantime, feel free to Google those terms a little bit and you can read up. Thanks for your attention and participation, and I'll see you guys next week.